for our next session, I'll be handing over to Dr. Oho Okiti. He's the MD Business Day, and he will be handling the panel on the global economic crisis, how deep it is, and how protracted it will be. Dr. Okiti.
Yeah, thank you very much, Tayo, for that introduction. Warm welcome to our audience here in Nigeria and wherever you're joining us all over the world. My name is Okiti, and I'm the Managing Director of Business Day Media Limited. And I'll be moderating this last and final session for this for today and for this afternoon. As Tayo has said, the focus here is to look at how deep and how long we think the economic recession will be. And I can assure you, and I have no doubt in my mind that there is no panel better equipped to look at this issue and the dynamics. So let me introduce the panel to you in alphabetical order. I have Achaleke joining us from South Africa. He is the chairman of McKinsey and Company. He oversees the work of McKinsey in the continent from South Africa. Acha, you are most welcome this afternoon. Good to see you.
Thank you. Thanks for the invitation.
Yeah, thank you. And we also have Charles Robertson. Charles Robertson is the Global Chief Economist for Renaissance Capital. He's based in London. Charles, welcome to this conversation. And we also have Sutura Aisha Bello, and she is the Public-Private Partnership Component lead of the UK Nigeria Infrastructure Advisory Facility. That's a NIAF based in Abuja, the capital of Nigeria. Sutura, you're welcome to this conversation.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, thank you. And of course, the last and of course not the least, I have our Statistician General, Dr. Yemi Kale, who is also the head of the Nigeria Bureau of Statistics. Dr. Yemi, you are welcome to this conversation.
Thank you for inviting me.
Yeah, for the audience, this promises to be very exciting. So let me just give this instruction ahead. If you want to ask any of our panelists any questions, please go to log on to your Slido and with the code hashtag BD, that's BD in capital letters, ANC 2020. And you'll be able to ask your questions. Please indicate whom the question is for. So very quickly, we have just about an hour for this program, in fact 50 minutes. So I'm just gonna go straight. I would like to encourage our panelists to please answer the question in about 2.5 minutes. We have quite a lot to cover this afternoon. We have about 4 sessions. I'm going to be starting with understanding the data, the growth data that we have. Dr. Yemi Kale, I think you want to kick off this session. Can you please provide some understanding of the growth data that we saw in Q1, both in the context of pre-economic conditions before the emergence of COVID-19 and the expectation of a confirmation of economic recession in the coming months, especially given that Nigeria recorded 1.8 growth, but whereas in most other regions it was negative. Can you please just give us a reaction to that and let us understand the data? Thank you.
Okay, I think as everybody already is aware, since 2016, the economy has been trying to recover from that recession, and it has been recovering extremely slowly. And that's where we are. So we are getting gradual improvements in the economy right up to Q1 2020. Now, a lot of people would say that, well, the lockdown in Nigeria only started at the beginning of the second quarter. So the growth in Q1 had there was no impact of COVID on the growth in Q1. That's not exactly true. And that's because the Nigerian economy is still tied to the global economy, and many countries that Nigeria depends on, China, for example, India, some countries in Europe and the US, were already feeling the impacts of COVID, and the implications were a drop in oil demand and in prices of oil. And we know that, I've said this several times, that even though oil has only 10% contribution to GDP, it has about indirectly and directly about 60% implications on the entire Nigerian economy. So we're already seeing the impact of COVID on the Nigerian economy, even though the Nigerian economy had not yet registered many cases and had not even locked down at that time. So what you see in Q1 is a combination of an already struggling economy since 2016 and the early effects of COVID affecting the Nigerian economy, but mostly as a result from outside. Now, what you're going to see in Q2 is now the full-blown impact of COVID, likely as a result of domestic factors. And that's basically what it's going to lead to. I'm fairly certain that Q2 is going to have a very strong negative growth. And as far as are we going to get into recession in Q3 is concerned, which is likely, although I don't think it's inevitable, it will depend on a lot of things that we do between now and then and the third quarter. The previous session with the Honorary Minister of Finance, Budget and National Planning stated things that the government is trying to do. And as long as those things are done pretty quickly, we might be able to avoid negative growth in Q3. And if we avoid negative growth in Q3, and again, it's very unlikely. If we avoid negative growth in Q3, then we'd avoid a technical recession. Although I believe that for the entire 2020, GDP growth in Nigeria would definitely be negative.
Okay, thank you very much. Actually, I want to move very quickly to you. Given the trajectory of the COVID-19 itself, starting in China, I mean, of course, Europe, the US, when do you think the uncertainty and the disruption in supply chains started to provide an element of contagion, especially in relation to Africa?
Yeah. No, thanks. I think it's a fundamental question, right? And the answer is nobody really knows. If you look at where we are today as a continent, we woke up this morning to about 250,000 cases across Africa, right? The top three countries, South Africa, Egypt, and Nigeria, accounting for probably half of those cases. Governments, like we heard the Minister of Finance say, have been putting a number of measures in place across the continent. But the challenge we have is that we've had to start reopening our economies before we hit the peak, right? And so across most of our countries, we're tracking sort of countries that are under lockdown. We see fewer and fewer countries under national lockdowns, and maybe some partial lockdowns, some regions. But the reality is we have to reopen our economies, to be able to preserve livelihoods, right? But we're doing that before we hit the peak. Now, implications are, one is, it will take longer for us to hit the peak just because more people are going out, so more people are going to catch the disease. And the reality, we're already starting to see the exponential uptake, right? You can see the exponential uptake in South Africa. You can clearly see it in Egypt. You're starting to see it in Nigeria as well, to be honest, right? So you're starting to see that. And so, so we're going to hit the peak later on, right? And the peak is going to be higher. That's the implication. Now, what does that mean for supply chains? The reality is, the rest of the world is starting to recover to a certain extent. Many of our trading partners, right? They're not there yet, but they're actually starting to recover. But the question is, as we reopen our domestic economies, how much of the international economies will be willing to trade with us when we have not reached our peak yet? I think that's a bit of the challenge we're going to face. We're going to reopen our domestic economies, and to a certain extent, they're going to function in some cases. We'll have to work on the muscle of reopening, closing certain areas, reopening, reclosing, and so as businesses and people are going to have to deal with it. But I think the fundamental question is, how much is the rest of the world going to be really to interact, to fly here, to accept some of our exports, to export products to us when we haven't hit our peak yet. It's not clear yet, and that's something we're going to have to discuss.
Yeah. Oh, thank you very much for the answer. I want to follow up with you on that. What Acha has just explained is in relation to to the trajectory. However, underlying that is the behavior of people in Africa. I'm sure you probably listened to the Commissioner for Health this morning explaining why the typical model they have seen in Lagos is different from the global model we saw in Europe and in the US. Surely talking about underlying conditions. So if you go out on the street in Nigeria today, to majority of people, it appears as if nothing is actually happening. So how does this behavior, especially given what Asha has just explained, and the behavior that you see on the street of Nigeria today, how do you think that will shape the data later in the year?
I think it's going to have a significant impact, particularly because we have a large part of our population that's not very well educated, and large swaths of the North, persons still believe that COVID won't affect them, or it's something that's a disease which doesn't affect everyone. There are certain categories. Some people believe it's a disease that maybe it won't affect Black people to a large extent. And so because of that, even the protections and the social distancing that's required is not really being observed. Face masks are seen more in the cities, but even in the cities, they're not widely used. You find it more in places like Lagos and Abuja, but beyond that, it's not really very common. So for a lot of educated people, they understand the implications of the disease and they are doing their best. However, a large swath of the population, they need to go out every day in order to earn their daily bread and find a way to eat. Social distancing eliminates some of the businesses in which they need to earn a living, and they're not doing that.
Interesting. Thank you very much. Charles, I want to bring you in, and I want you to bring the context, the global context into this. For many of the developed countries, the China, US, Europe, the first quarter was very, very bad. But the expectation is that Q2 will be worse. So how do you think Q2 being worse will shape economic development in a country like Nigeria and other emerging economies?
Again, I have to start with the we don't know, but having done that, I'm personally of the view that it's going to be a little bit more V-shaped than some think. The World Bank has come out with a lot of very negative views for the world economy just in the last few weeks. I think they're doing that faced with the data we do have, which is pretty poor. But we just had some retail sales figures out of America for May, 18% rise month on month, after a smaller than that fall in April. So the Americans stopped shopping in April, but shopped in even bigger numbers than ever in May. So it looks like they are racing back to the shops. And we're hearing the same sort of retail recovery already in the May and June figures, just anecdotally in Europe as well. While China had its worst period in February, and by April, May was already looking considerably better. So I'm hoping that the big stimulus we've seen from the Fed, ECB, from governments are going to make this relatively V-shaped. That then lifts the global economy in the second half. That then gives oil prices a bit of a support, and Nigeria will be looking a little bit healthier before the end of this year. Is my hope.
Okay, thank you for that. And I want to go to some nitty-gritty of the data, and this will be my final question on the data aspect. And Dr. Yemi Caleb, given that we are just 2 weeks to the end of this quarter, what do we already know about Nigeria's growth data for Q2? Especially because it requires a kind of understanding. FCT was shut down, Lagos was shut down, Ogun State was shut down, but not many other states were really shut down apart from the restriction on interstate and on the airlines. So can you give us a sense of the growth data that you are seeing in Q2? Maybe in, of course, aviation is out of it, but I'll be particularly interested in agriculture, in telecoms. I mean, are there any of the sectors actually holding up? What should we look out for?
Microphone.
You're on mute.
Sorry about that. I was saying that let me start off by the 3 states that you said were shut down, while many other states weren't. First of all, those 3 states are almost half of the Nigerian economy. Combine Lagos, FCT, and Ogun State. So that's already bad enough. But I want to approach it from the person. And if you look at the 46 economic activities that make up the Nigerian economy, apart from agriculture, the economy is largely driven by services, and the services sector is largely FCT, it's largely Lagos, and that's where everything is. So once you expect a collapse in the services sector, you expect it to happen in Lagos, and you expect it to happen in FCT. Now, the best way to look at what will happen in Q2, and I'm seeing some of the numbers already, which, like I said, points to a very, 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 very poor second quarter, although I'm not going to state the actual numbers at this point because we are still collecting. Now, if you break down the 46 activities, it's very easy to understand what is likely to happen. I like to do this by focusing first on the 7 economic activities that account for about 70% of GDP. So we start with agriculture. Now, agriculture was affected, but not significantly, because there's restrictions in movement and things of that nature. Farmers cannot go to their farms as quickly as possible. But it's not as significant because agriculture in Nigeria is still rain-fed. You don't need to really have a lot of movement for output. About 90% of agricultural output is still subsistence farming, is still smallholder farms all over the place and so on. So that's unlikely to be significantly affected. Then you go to trade. Trade is the second largest economic activity. Trade is significantly going to be affected, obviously, because you have domestic trade and you have imports. That's what makes up your trade. Your imports were completely, more or less, stopped in the second quarter, and your domestic trade, which is basically as a result of domestic production, manufacturing and so on, which is largely based in Lagos, for example, was also affected significantly. Then you go to real estate. There's nothing really happening in real estate. There was nothing happening in that quarter. So I talked. You go to telecoms. Telecoms actually benefited from the pandemic. It's actually largely as a result of improvement in data. So telecoms actually came out looking good. You go to manufacturing. You've heard what those in manufacturing were saying. We are seeing what the numbers are saying was hit significantly as a result of the pandemic in Q2. Then you go to crude production and oil prices. We know exactly what happened as far as that's concerned. Now that is your 70% of the Nigerian economy, which most of them actually having serious challenges, and those that didn't have serious challenges struggling with only one of them, and that's telecom doing actually well. So you expect significant problems. So you look at the other 30%, hotels and restaurants. That's largely a Lagos FCT thing. You look at accommodation. Sorry, that's the same thing. You look at art, entertainment, recreation, all the shutdown of shows and the movie theaters and so on. They are very small. They have very small contribution to Nigerian, but they are all hit. You look at other services, they are all hit. You look at construction. Again, these are things very small. They contribute very little to Nigerian economy. But what you are saying is that the 46 activities, probably not more than 4, either had a little negative or no effect whatsoever. But the rest of them, meaning 40 or so economic activities, would have significant challenges in Q2. And that's what the numbers are showing. So I'm expecting a very serious, a very difficult Q2. And I think Q1 did better than we had estimated, actually. We are hoping that the performance of Q1 actually might help the overall numbers for 2020, but we expect Q2 to be very, very negative. The figures we are seeing so far is very, very negative. Looking at it from the consumption, from the expenditure approach, household incomes are significantly impacted. When you lock down Lagos, that has the largest micro businesses, for example, micro and small businesses in the country, that is where your consumption is coming from. That's where your population that consumes. We saw the expenditure data, Lagos, the share of Lagos in expenditure. So if Lagos is shut down, if FCT is shut down, you can see the huge impact to have on consumption. Consumption is 70% of your GDP, and consumption was really hit. So in Q2 and maybe in Q3, we're going to have a very poor outing. I am not as confident as Charles is about a V-shape, not for Nigeria anyway, for two reasons. One is looking at the economic structure of Nigeria that is tied very significantly to oil prices. And if you look at Prof's argument that he doesn't expect oil prices to shoot up anytime soon, it means there's going to be a serious issue for Nigeria. Looking at oil demand and the OPEC agreements has cut down on oil output potential, and with low prices, I don't expect the oil sector to do significantly. And if the oil sector does poorly, we know the impact on the rest of the economy. And the second part is looking at the history of Nigeria with economic recession. We've never really come out of any V-shape. It's always been slow. Look at the last three recessions: slow, gradual, very difficult, and that's because of dysfunctional structure that the Nigerian economy has. I don't see this is even the worst of them all, in my opinion. So I don't see a V-shape for Nigeria. I think it's probably a U-shape with that bottom being very, very, very long. I think that's where we're going to see. In 2016, the recession was not this bad, and already it took so long for us to get out of it. So I think I expect this will be a very long, drawn-out recovery.
And that is where I want to actually start the second round of questions. The pre-COVID-19 economic conditions in Nigeria. Of course, had the recession in 2016, and between that 2016 and 2020, two things actually happened. One is growth has been less than 3%. In fact, at some point it was just over 1%, 1.8, and the largest growth we had was 2.8 in Q4 2019. So that was the first thing. The second thing was that the economy actually has not reached the levels that it reached before the economic recession of 2016. That level in terms of GDP size, it has not reached that level. So actually, I want to start with you there. How do you think these preconditions, as following up from what Yemi Kale actually said, how do you think these preconditions will actually affect any kind of recovery that we may have?
Yeah. No, I think it's a fundamental question. I'm more with Yemi than I am with Charlie, to be honest, right? In terms of, I'm generally an optimist, right? When I look at Africa in general and Nigeria in particular, I think it's going to take some time, right? So we run 9 scenarios around the world, and we run it for different countries, including Nigeria. And we survey 2,000 executives every couple of weeks just to get a sense for which of these scenarios they think is the most likely. The one executive today think is most likely is sort of return to pre-2019 levels more in Q1, Q2 2022, right? That's more the business side, right? So that's roughly where globally, and in some countries will get there quicker, some will get there later, but that's roughly where they are. I think the challenge with Nigeria is Nigeria actually facing 3 crises, right? Nigeria is facing the global, and that's in many of African countries. Nigeria is facing the global pandemic, right? So we talked about supply chains. Just to give you a sense, for every dollar of product manufactured in Africa today, we import about 40 cents of inputs, right, across the continent. And a lot of that comes from China, right? So that has been disrupted, it had a massive impact on our exports, as you've seen oil from Nigeria, but whether it's cocoa from Ghana or flowers from Kenya, right, same thing. We then have the African pandemic, and we talked about household expenditure, so that has really impacted, I think first on movement of people. So the tourism sector, business tourism, for example, in Nigeria, impacted, plus, household expenditure, business expenditures, and then oil, right? So oil has had, as we've heard the Minister of Finance say many times, has a massive, massive impact on the economy. So it faces those 3 crises. And I would say in 2016, we only faced 1 crisis in Nigeria, which was the oil crisis, right? And we saw what happened. And so now we're facing 3. So I do think it's going to take much longer. I think the government is putting in place, the right set of measures that we've seen other governments put. Some people could argue, can we do more in certain areas? Can we do less? But I'll say 2 things. One is this, the minister also talked about, don't waste a good crisis. I think it's an opportunity for us to really reflect on what are some of these tough measures, right? We talked about subsidies and those kinds of things. What are the tough measures we not be willing to take? And just because, we're against the wall now, we have to take them. So what are these tough measures we have to take? But at the end, and I always say that, I've done a lot of work in Nigeria and I love it, but it's all about execution, right? I think that's really where we've really not been able to deliver in many cases, right? So the question for me is, beyond all these measures, we're going to have the right measures and the right plan in place. The question for me is, how do you really execute against that to make it happen in practice?
Yeah. Thank you for that. Charles, I want to give you an opportunity to talk about the shapes of the shape of the economic recession that you actually emceed. And I want you to come from the global economic context, because I think that is where you were actually talking about the global economic context. And the idea is that we could actually have a U shape, or we can have an L shape. I mean, some people worry that Nigeria will start using the word GOP, but the point here is that what are the economic developments? I mean, whether from a global perspective or a domestic perspective, I think will actually shape the curve. I mean, in whether it's going to be L shape, V shape, or a U shape. What are those developments that you think will determine that?
I think from our perspective, we're going to be focusing on services. As Yemi was saying, it's been a service-led recession. We've never seen one quite like this before. It will be retail sales, which is why I was quite excited by those US figures out just this afternoon. And where that's picking up, then we can get some degree of confidence. It's clearly not going to be very V-shaped in certain sectors, like aviation. That's going to be problematic. It's much easier to imagine internal flights within Europe, or flights from Europe, say, to Mauritius, which has cancelled out the virus, which has crushed it. Then it's going to see into other international travel. So we'll be paying attention to retail sales, also paying attention a bit to the oil price as a leading indicator for actually what's going on with the world economy. We'd love to think that there was something else which was the lead indicator for the world economy, but it tends to be oil. So that's what I'll be looking for, and I'll be watching out for this second wave worry of the virus. So that's certainly a threat in America. In fact, it's not even a second wave. It is a first wave that they never controlled. And I'm a bit concerned about South Asia as well. I think the numbers in India, Pakistan and Bangladesh could be huge, way in excess of anything we've seen anywhere else. And that, I think, comes from the challenge of trying to do lockdown or not be able to afford lockdown in very low-income countries. So it's hard to see how that's going to play out. It may be that people just can cope with the virus, like countries like Sweden and Belarus already have shown that they can. But to answer your first question, I'll be paying attention to retail sales.
Okay, thank you very much. I mean, you mentioned three important parameters there, or let me say variables. I mean, the oil price, the retail sales, and of course, the trajectory of the infections itself. Before I come back to Yemi Kale, and after that, Sutra, our audience, I would just like to remind you, please go to Slido and ask our panel the questions that you have. And that is hashtag BD ANC 2020. Dr. Yemi, you started discussion around the past recessions and looking at the 1987, the 2016 recession. And of course, even though we didn't experience recession in 2009 and 2008 and 2009, but there was a global economic crisis. Do you think there are enough lessons in these recessions to help us in this recovery?
I think every recession that Nigeria has faced, every challenge Nigeria has faced, has always had significant lessons for us to learn. The difference is that we never take advantage of them. We never have. We get upset. We start trying to, and unfortunately for Nigeria, we kind of get out of it, or looks as if we are getting out of it, and just because of that, we go back to our bad behaviors of the past. So I've never been one that has been an advocate of recessions ending very quickly for Nigeria, because that creates a situation where we misbehave and don't complete what we are meant to do. So there are lots of lessons that we have learned. There are lots of opportunities that we have to take advantage of, some of which we are doing. There is our reserves, for example, are dangerously low. And this is another reason why I feel that V shape might not work, because at the end of the day, imported inputs, like Mr. Wishika says, about 40–50% of manufacturing companies, for example. So that means there's a huge jump in their cost of production. And your GDP, you have to remember, is both output, which is focused on the consumer, as well as intermediate cost, which is the cost of production of the businesses. So already the dollar has been adjusted at 3.6. That's an automatic increase in costs of producers. So again, you're squeezing local production. I think the difference between Nigeria and other countries is the fact that the palliatives that some of these countries introduced was to keep consumers spending. So there was direct cash into their hands to keep jobs from dropping as much as possible, though millions of jobs were lost. But despite the fact that millions of jobs were lost, people were still getting unemployment benefits. So that retail consumption spending that Charlie is talking about can work in those countries almost immediately because they have cash. In the case of Nigeria, there's no cash. People lost their jobs or got their salaries reduced, so they don't lose their jobs. So even when the economy opens up and so on, nobody has cash. Millions of people have lost their jobs already. They're not going to get any income from that. It's going to be very hard for them to get more jobs and so on. So the lessons we are learning is pay attention to your consumers, because as far as Nigeria is concerned, as far as most countries in the world are concerned, the consumer is the one that keeps the economy going. And anything you do that affects the ability of that consumer to spend, you're going to hit your economy very hard. People don't produce for the sake of producing. They produce because they can sell to consumers. So no matter how much you support manufacturers, if manufacturers do not have people to buy their product, they're not going to produce. So we keep focusing on the manufacturers, the producers, and we keep forgetting that the consumers, the households, have to have income to be able to buy these goods and services from the producers of those goods and services. So I believe when your economy is 70%, focus your measures to those to that 70% that holds your economy up.
Wow, thank you very much. Sutura, I want to come to you here, especially given your role as an advisor to the government on public-private partnership. There's something that is very, very clear in the last 5 years, and it is that the federal government has borrowed extensively. And if you ask, oh, why are you borrowing this? And they tell you to expand Nigeria's infrastructure. But given the debt growth and the weak economic growth that we've seen in the last 5 years, in hindsight, do you see this as an optimal strategy? And how should we now handle such situation going forward? I think you're muted. Yeah.
Well, post-COVID, it's definitely not an optimal strategy. I think countries all over the world are experiencing financial problems from the pandemic, and Nigeria is no different. Nigeria is in a very difficult financial situation, and ignoring the private sector's ability to partner and provide infrastructure and its attendant services is one that will delay any recovery from any recession. It is pertinent for government to try to find a way to work with private sector, to bring private sector in locally and internationally, to be able to provide some of the infrastructure that we need in order for the economy to grow. It's okay to borrow, but if we're borrowing and that borrowing is not going to productive sectors, if part of that borrowing is only going to recurrent expenditure, how do we pay some of that money back? The government can play a critical role in enabling multi-sectoral partnerships post-COVID. And it is in a very good position now to be able to send a clear signal to investors, because for a very long time, investors have had a very uncertain message when it comes to PPPs in Nigeria. For example, if you take foreign direct investment, in 2018, Ghana overtook Nigeria. FDI dropped by 36%, according to UNCTAD. In Nigeria, we only got in about 2.2 billion, while at the same period in 2018, Ghana was able to bring in about 3.3 billion. So it's really important for the country to be able to have post-COVID a very clear pipeline of critical transformational investable projects that investors can look at and see that this is a set of projects that the government has coalesced around, transformational projects, and what the UN now calls people first projects. Because the gap between the rich and the poor in this pandemic is only going to get bigger. It was already big, but with the pandemic, more poor people are suffering than the rich people. And so whatever infrastructure that you direct your stimulus towards, if that infrastructure does not take into consideration people first, then the impact that you're looking for will not be as large as you need it to be.
Yeah, thank you for that. And one thing that is becoming very, very clear from the conversations before now is that fiscal policies are very, very important. So let me remind you, and of course, the Honorable Minister for Finance also mentioned these two things. But let me remind you, the federal government, they said that they have removed the subsidy. That was the first thing they said. And the Honorable Minister also said that the fall in oil prices actually made that possible, meaning it made it easy for them to remove the subsidy. The second thing that they have entered is a rationalization of government, making the government leaner. However, I mean, I'm sure many people that have followed Nigeria history will understand where I'm coming from. In 2016 as well, there was a removal of subsidy until oil prices actually went up. And also in that same year, there was also a mention of rationalization of government. So actually, there was this statement you have made in the past, and you have also mentioned it here, but I really want you to expand on that. I mean, why is the execution of fiscal policies for long-term prosperity and development of Nigeria, why is it just so difficult?
I mean, I think execution in general is difficult. I don't think it's a Nigeria-specific thing, right? I think it's generally difficult. I think in all the work we do in public sector, especially around the world, but or across the continent, it's even more difficult, right? And there are a number of reasons. One is just the monitoring. So it's easy to say, okay, yes, we're going to cut costs, right? And we're going to, reduce expenditures, and we're going to do these. But how was the process to actually monitor this, right, on a regular basis, right? So they put a plan together, and we've done many of these, right, put a plan. But the first thing is then how do we monitor it? What is the team that's going to monitor it? How empowered are they to monitor it? How, who then monitors it, right? And who monitors on a regular basis to say, okay, we had said we're going to take out 100 billion naira of cost. Where are we today? How much have we taken out? We're only at 60. What's it going to take to get to 100? Yeah, in some cases we overestimated here. Okay, fine. How do we compensate? So all of those conversations, I think that's one. Two is just the we call it typical steering committee, the group of people who will oversee this, right? I think in many cases what we've seen is, we have these, pronouncements, we're going to do this, but then you divulge it down to the MDAs to do it. But then, what we lack is the oversight at the most senior level, right? To really say, okay, let me sit down every month, right? And see where we are, what needs to happen, and then see that through. The third thing, and that's always very difficult, what happens in private sector. In private sector, if you don't deliver, the consequences, right? That's quite hard in the public sector, as you can imagine, consequence management. But what are other ways to make sure if somebody doesn't deliver, right? The consequences attached to that, right? Do you get somebody else to come and oversee it? Do you move them to the side? Do you send them to do something else? So I think there are a number of ways, and some governments have done it quite successfully, right? We have a number of governments, everybody raised about, what Rwanda, for example, does, what Ethiopia does. I think the lessons learned, we can learn from what Malaysia has done. I know, the Malaysians also were helping the government in Nigeria in the past, right? So I think it's not rocket science, but I think it's really a commitment and willingness to say we're going to execute things. We have a plan now, which is great, but we're going to execute very differently on this plan to make sure it happens, right? And learning a lot of the lessons from the private sector.
Yeah, thank you for that. And also staying on fiscal policy, I will come back to Yemi Kale shortly, but I want to ask Charles on this. The United Nations UNCTAD, that's the Conference on Trade and Development, following up on what Sutura actually said. They said the global economy, is on track. FDI is on track to decline about 40%. Given that Nigeria was not even able to attract much in the last 5 years, and given where you sit, amongst the investors, some of them in Nigeria, what is even our chance, given the fiscal policies that we're not making so much progress, given the global economic context, given the competition we have for FDI, what is even our chance of even getting the little from FDI, and what is investor sentiment concerning Nigeria at this time?
Well, that's a tough question because the answer is pretty tough, which is the sentiment is pretty negative. The best V-shaped recovery we ever saw in emerging markets was probably 97, 98, the Asian crisis. And they all devalued their currencies. Within a year, all of their electronic production, their manufacturing suddenly became so much more competitive in the world economy, and they did really, really well. To many people's surprise, people thought the whole kind of capitalist model of Asia was a little bit messy. There was a little bit too much connection to the government, but nonetheless, they rebounded very well. The difficulty for Nigeria in capturing the rebound, well, firstly, oil. The long-term oil price over the last 25 years has averaged about $63. We don't think it's going to get back to $63 next year. No one really knows, but our base guess is about $50 now. So you're going to be under the long-term average. And the second thing that would be great to see would obviously be some sort of manufacturing renaissance. But, I've done a lot of work on this, and I've been trying to work out what countries have got right when they've industrialized. It's been education first, and Nigeria is getting there, but hasn't hit this 70% metric of adult literacy, which seems to be, for 200 years now, the essential level you need before you can industrialize. Then you need electricity. And everyone in Nigeria, not just Nigeria, South Africa would say they have an issue too, but everyone knows that there's issues about the supply and the regularity of electricity. Ghana's got 3 times as much electricity per person as Nigeria. Their adult literacy is nearly 80% versus Nigeria's 60, 65. So the factories and the foreign investors are more likely to put their investment into a Ghana, and which is exactly the point made by Satura before, than Nigeria. And in the short term, that's not easy to change. The government needs to get education right, needs to get electricity right. And if it gets those right, then it can get investment right. And the exchange rate sits there as this big cloud, which constantly comes over and rains on Nigeria every few years, it seems, at the moment. And that's another difficulty for foreign investors. But we can touch on that more. I'm sure you'll come to that before the end of the session.
Yeah, thank you very much. And we're nearing the end of the session. And before I come to one or two questions that I have here, Sutura, I want to ask, given your engagement with government, because that is what NIAB does. NIAB does not execute anything, but NIAB does engage the government. Do you really think, that the government will pursue any fundamental economic reform following COVID-19? The serious reforms that we've all known about for, 5, 10, 15 years. Do you foresee any of that happening?
I am an optimist, and I feel that the economic pandemic, the COVID pandemic, is something that none of us have ever seen before. And I think if there was ever a will to make any changes or to push through the reforms that we need to push through, this is the time. And if you look at what's happening with insecurity around certain parts of the country, already the signs of what will happen if the change doesn't come is already evident. And I think that the government of the day is aware of what's going on. And from the engagement that we're having with government, they are doing a lot of things to try to address what's going on, particularly in the short term post-COVID. And then with the longer plan for the economic sustainability going up to 12 months. So I really do believe that this is an opportunity that the government will take to make some real change.
Okay, thank you. I have one question here from one of our participants. He said, has Nigeria grown its capabilities in ensuring optimal utilization of external debts, such that return on investment purely from debts could pay our debts? I don't know who wants to give that a try. After answering that question, we're going to take our closing remarks. I don't want to ask SG that question, so let me ask Hacha.
I thought you would ask Charlie. So you know, I mean, the answer is I don't know. If you look at Nigeria, right? I mean, we clearly, you know, we've had a revenue problem. We always talked about tax revenue for a while, but we've had a revenue problem, right? And the big question, even pre-COVID, was how do you really significantly accelerate revenue generation for the country, right? So I think that's part of it. In a context where across Africa, you know, revenue to Africa general revenue to GDP is about 19%. And then we take 22% of that revenue and we pay off debt, right? So, you know, so we've had a general revenue problem, 19% to GDP in Africa. In Nigeria, it's worse than that, right? So I think the first thing is if you want to pay off that debt, how do you generate the capacity to pay off that debt, right? So I think, so I think there's, again, a big focus on trying to figure out, but in this depressed economy, how do you generate increased revenue, you know, from taxes where country companies are struggling? It's not going to be easy, right? Non-tax revenue on the oil front is going to be difficult as well, right? So, you know, as much as, you know, we have that lever, that may be challenging. So you say, what else can you do? It's about reducing cost, right? So now we have all the plans in place to reduce it. How do you make sure that actually happens? That when you say you fundamentally reduce your cost base, that's back to my focus on execution to make sure we say we're going to take out this much of cost out of government costs. Let's make sure we do that, right? And then over time, we're not going to be in this situation forever, right? So really starting to think through reimagining what could Africa look like going forward? What could it look like for Nigeria going forward? What are new opportunities that emerge for the country, right? To again, drive this revenue. So I think, you know, it's not going to be easy in the short term. I think that's what as you were saying, it's not going to be easy in the short term, but it's going to be even, that's why it's even more focused on us making sure we deliver on, you know, the cost containment measures, and then making sure over time we start to really look for new avenues to generate more revenue.
Okay, so as we are definitely coming to the end of this session, so I want to ask all my my esteemed panelists one simple question, the same question for you all. And this panel is about answering, how deep and how long do we think the recession will be? And I understand all that has been said in terms of the dynamics that will shape this. So let me ask this, putting all those together, I want to ask you two questions in one. In your best estimate, one, when do you think Nigeria will come out of recession? But I think that is not as important as if we do not see strong growth in the next 2-3 years, given what you have said, actually, given what Yemi has said, and of course, even the pessimism expressed by Sutura and Charles, what do you guys think will happen to poverty, inequality, jobs, security? Because you see, these are economic discussions, but the social impact is even worse when we don't have strong economic growth. Because if we do not have that strong economic growth in the next 3 years, it means that for almost a decade, we may not return to the size of GDP we saw in 2015. And given all the birth rate, and all the challenges of the country, what does this mean for Nigeria? So as you sum up, please, could you please just answer those two questions in one? What is your best estimate regarding recession? And what does happen, given the economic crisis, to jobs, inequality, insecurity, and of course, poverty? Sutura, you can go first. 1.5 minutes, please. Very quickly.
Okay. I think the best estimate for the recession, it's like what the SG said, it will be a long one. Particularly because our institutions are weak and their ability to respond quickly might take a little bit longer. In terms of the impact on poverty, jobs, and on the poor, I think if we do not seize this moment, the security challenges are going to population in this country. And if we do not find a way to mitigate the impact of COVID on this large, young population, the security implications will be significant. Thank you.
Charles.
Yeah, look, I'm going to say the same thing that I said in 2015-16. If you keep a currency steady when your main export crashes, then yes, it's a shallower hit to the economy at first, but it takes a much longer time to recover. If you have currency flexibility, you can have more of a V-shaped story. So the Russian ruble, I was just checking, dropped 35% in 2 months and is now rallied back 16% because the currency becomes the safety valve and enables you to get back to quicker growth. And if you don't get decent growth in Nigeria, then I do wonder whether people are going to say, people who are worse off per capita since 2015 now, are they going to end up saying the whole structure of this is wrong? And we saw that sort of challenge from communism in Europe in the early 19th century, when there was massive numbers of young people and commodity-driven economies like Russia were saying, we're not getting enough benefit from this story. And you ended up with revolution. So I would like to see Nigeria getting better quicker. That would be ideal.
Yeah, thank you very much. Archer.
Yeah, I think very aligned with what Sutura and Charlie said. I mean, at the end of the day, I was actually reflecting, the SG can tell us, I don't think since the recession, Nigeria has grown faster than population growth. I think population growth is what, maybe 2.5% or so, right? And so we're talking about, I'm very clear, Nigeria is most likely going to go into recession this year, unfortunately, just like the whole continent, by the way, for the first time in 25 years. Yes, we can focus on when are we going to come out of recession, right? Hopefully, we'll technically come out of recession, hopefully next year sometime. But the key question for me is how do we really get to decent growth, right? How do we get to 6, 7, 8% growth, which is what people say we need double digits. I like it, but how do you even get to 6, 7, 8% growth, which, then you start to say, per capita GDP is starting to grow. You're starting to get, children who are not ending up being poorer than the parents, right? And so that's what we need to. And, and I think we struggled for many, many years now to get there, right? And I think to what Sutura and Charlie say, if we don't get there, all these risks around, yes, you'll get a lot more poor people, you'll get a lot less educated people, has a much more fundamental issue long-term on the economy. But I think there's a security issue, right, which we really need to realize is real, right? And so for all these reasons, I think the focus in my mind should be, yes, how do we, recover and get our recession, but the bigger focus should be how do we get to I'd call it 6, 7, 8% growth, if not double digits.
So thank you very much. So Yemi Kale, so let me ask you, since you are the SG, when are you going to give us strong growth? When are you going to give us strong growth data? We need some.
To determine when strong growth is given, I can only report whatever growth is happening in the economy. But I think I agree with. I would say that coming out of recession, which I think is a lot less important, probably early next year, and that's probably because of the base effect of 2020. Yeah. It was so bad, and coming out of recession just means positive growth. I think the impact of the risk of the recession is going to be much longer, and that we barely recovered from the impact of the 2016 one. So coming out of recession early 2021, but the impact will last a bit longer. And of course, we understand the implications for the implication for employment and poverty is straightforward. People, the economy grows. If the economy is growing, it means that people are demanding more, and it means that production has to go up. And means businesses are hiring more people. The more people they hire, more jobs means they also are coming out of poverty. And so that's actually a lot more straightforward. I have to emphasize something. Based on the last poverty study, yes, 40% of Nigerians were in poverty, but you see another 20-25% that were just above the poverty line. So that tells you, look, the slightest shock push everybody back into poverty. So that's the part where I'm more worried about. That yes, people were just above, but there's still a huge 20% that were just above the poverty line. And you can see the implications of having the economy growing strongly. All you did was shut down. I use Lagos for example for a few weeks, and what people were saying is, "I can no longer feed." That's another way of looking at a long-term recession. If you prevent people from having the ability to, this was government policy by shutting down the economy. But I'm saying it's the same impact. If the benefits of the economy, strong growth is not coming out, they're going to have that same, I'm going to work, fine, but I'm still unable to feed. And that reaction that we saw in Lagos is going to be exactly the same thing that's going to happen for a long-term negative impact of a recession in Nigeria. I think that's what we are more worried and more concerned about as far as security is concerned.
I thank you all. Given that we have come to the end of this very exciting session, and I want to thank the panel that has graciously accepted to speak. Archaleke, Charles Robertson, Suture, and of course, Yemi Kale, the Statistician General. Thank you all. Let me just also say at this point, close the session for today. I'd like to thank before the first session, the second, the third, and of course of this session, we thank you all. And of course, the participants and our audience that have joined us from within Nigeria and outside Nigeria, we thank you all. This is a 2-day event. Come to the end of the first day. The second day comes up tomorrow and it starts by 11 a.m. And today we've looked mostly at macro issues. Tomorrow we are looking at energy, education, and of course, looking at an exciting session, looking at the past success story in Nigeria in terms of policies and what we can replicate this time. So at this point, I would like to hand over to Tayo Fabule, who is going to wrap up what's happened to the polls, the questions on the polls that we did. So thank you all. Thank you, Hata. Thank you, Charles. Thank you, Suture, and thank you, Yemi Kale, for joining me this afternoon. It's an interesting discussion, and of course, I'll see you all another time. Thank you. God bless you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Okiti, and thank you to our distinguished panelists, not just those who have just spoken now, but those who spoke earlier in the day, and also thank you to our participants who have held on with us throughout the day. It's been an interesting day, and for each panel, we've tried to hold a poll to fill the polls of what the participants have to say. So the show is not just for the panelists, but also for the participants. So when we asked our participants about the first session, which was on the response of the government so far to COVID, especially from the healthcare perspective, we asked, did the lockdown curb the spread? I think most of our participants said yes. 63% of them said it was effective. Do they think that the COVID-19 numbers in Nigeria reflect reality? No, is the answer. And it's an outright no. At least 88% do not doubt the numbers that are being reported daily. Do they think medical professionals are equipped, protected to handle the pandemic? 86% think they are not. And so basically giving feedback on what more needs to be done to protect those in the front line. Are they satisfied with the response of Nigeria so far? Again, about 61% do not think that is being done properly. At least 71% actually are not confident that enough is being done. Are they confident, positive about Nigeria post-COVID? We've had a lot of optimism despite the challenges. And it seems that optimism is also viral, like a virus itself. And they are positive about Nigeria. 72% are positive about Nigeria post-COVID. For our second panel, where we were discussing the governance and optimizing Nigeria's response, we asked our participants, do you think the virus exposed failure of governance in Nigeria? 95% of them think so. We asked if they thought that which of the sectors was most affected, and I think the economy, because the two options, was it health or economy? And most said it was the economy that has been most affected by the outbreak. Do they believe the present government structure is to blame for this response and the impact on the economy? 72% of them say yes, that the present governance structure isn't working to respond properly to the pandemic. What sector should government focus on? Education, health, small businesses, or economic relief? A good chunk of our respondents said, 27% of them actually, because it was a tie between health and economic relief, and we have most saying 27% saying education should be the focus. For our third panel, which was on mapping Nigeria's response, that's its physical response and strategy to the pandemic, we asked, do you support the immediate removal of fuel subsidy, which has been one of the new narratives that the pandemic has been able to make possible, and that thought of removing the subsidy? And 82% of them say yes, they want the subsidy removed. We also asked our participants, do you think the federal government is overborrowing? Another topical issue today during the discussions. And yes, 91% think the government is overborrowing. Are they satisfied with Nigeria's fiscal response to COVID-19? No, 77% of them think the response hasn't been effective. Are they also satisfied with Nigeria's fiscal response? Okay, so I've taken that already. They are not happy with the fiscal response. Do they think the government will downsize? Another new narrative that we're talking about, bold reforms that the pandemic is bringing to the table. Many of our participants, 69% of them, think government won't downsize its ministries, agencies, and departments. Should the government borrow or boost export its way out of the recession? Most of people that participated, 95% of them think it's better to export our way out of the recession rather than borrow, which was most of the things that were being discussed in our last panel today about the economy. Do they think the recession will be worse than that of 2016? And see if they're all on the same wavelength with the last panel today. They all say yes. 88% think that this recession that we have entered will be worse than that of 2016. Are they satisfied with Nigeria's monetary response to COVID-19? About 72% of them are unhappy with the response of the monetary response to COVID-19, and 66% of them are confident that a devaluation of the currency of the naira will help the economy rebound, which is one of the things that came up today as well. I would like to thank all of you who've been listening, and I pray and hope you'll join us tomorrow starting at 11 a.m. Thank you, and do have a good day, and please do stay safe.